Hey folks, I'm Blendini and welcome to my channel. Today we'll be modeling this cheeseburger in Blender 2.8. This is a simple model and all the materials are procedural. I'll do the modeling first and then the materials, and I'll put timestamps in the comments below for each section. Let's get started. Ideally you'd have the actual item to reference, but most of the time I base my work on a few images. I just do a Google search and see what comes up. These looked a little gross to me though, so I just kind of made it up as I went along. Delete the default cube and hide the camera and lamp. Add a circle, scale it out, and extrude it up. Add about 5 edge loops. Now go to the modifier tab and add a subsurface modifier. Right click on the object and enable shade smooth. Duplicate the object twice. This will serve as our bottom bun, top bun, and burger patty. Hide everything but the bottom bun. Enable proportional editing and use your scroll wheel to adjust the fall off as you scale the bottom and top faces. Unhide the burger object and use proportional editing to shape as desired. To add cheese, add a plane, subdivide it 10 or 11 times, and apply the cloth modifier to it. Select the burger patty and apply a collision modifier to it. Under soft body and cloth on the collision modifier, you'll find thickness outer, which represents a buffer around the outside of the mesh. Reduce this to 0.01. Now select the plane and hit play to animate the collision. There's still a bit of a gap here, and that's due to a similar setting on the cloth modifier. Find object collisions on the cloth modifier and lower the distance to something very small, and your colliding objects will have no gap between them. With the plane selected, go to the modifier tab and hit apply on the cloth modifier. Add a subdivision subsurface modifier and increase the viewport to 2. Add a solidify modifier and move it above the subsurface modifier. Increase the thickness to 0.04 and move the object up a bit. Right click to turn on shade smooth and go to the object menu to select set origin, origin to geometry. Now for the tomatoes. Add a circle. Change the number of vertices to 18. Scale it down and hit F to fill it with a face. Extrude up and hit I to inset that circle. Scale the inner circle down and add 6 edge loops. There are 3 main parts to a tomato. One is the juicy area where the seeds usually are. Then there's the inner skin and the outer skin. When cutting a tomato across, these create a star-like pattern. I'll mark each with a placeholder material for now. So select the faces that will make up the juicy area. Create a material and label it. Invert the selection, deselect the bottom face and the side faces, create a new material, and assign that to that material. Don't forget to click assign for each material selection, or else you'll have to go back like I did and reassign the faces to the proper materials. Select the side faces for the tomato skin, create a material for that. I've called it tomato edge. To make sure everything's done properly, I'll add placeholder colors to each material. Select the juice part, I've called it tomato inner 1, and extrude it down into the tomato slice. Inset the inner circle and push that inward as well. We're going to add a subsurface modifier, but first, add an edge loop and slide it up very close to the top face. Do the same with the bottom face. This will ensure these edges remain crisp after the modifier is applied. Add the subsurface modifier and enable smooth shading. Now, few things in nature are perfectly symmetrical, so make some modifications by pushing around a few random vertices. Now I'm going to position and scale the slice. There are many ways to manipulate a mesh in Blender, and I use these 2 slices to try out 2 of them. This first slice is positioned using proportional editing and adjusting the object's vertices. I decided to use a lattice for the last slice. Lattices are great for deforming complex meshes, which this slice is certainly not, but I wanted to try it out. Shift A to add a lattice. Scale it down until it's a tight box around the mesh. With the lattice selected, go to the lattice tab and increase the U and V resolution. Select the tomato slice and add a lattice modifier. Move it above the subsurface modifier. Use the eyedropper to select the lattice's object, which is the tomato slice. Any changes made to the lattice will now affect this mesh. Once you're happy with the shape, apply the lattice modifier and delete the lattice. Okay, from lattice to lettuce. Alright, sorry about that. Add a plane, subdivide it 15 times, add a displace modifier, add a new texture, and go to the Texture tab. Select Clouds as the type. Modify the shape of the lettuce by removing some of the faces. Add a Solidify modifier to give the lettuce some thickness, and follow up with a Subsurface modifier. Enable Smooth Shading, and go back to the Textures tab and modify the texture settings until you get something you like. I set the type to soft, the size to 0.13, and the depth to 3. S to scale the lettuce along the Z-axis. Make any final shape changes, then position the leaf on the burger. Duplicate it, change the shape again, rotate it, and position it on the burger as well. Do this as many times as you like. 3 seemed good to me. Select all the leaves you have and hit Ctrl J to join them into one object. Select the object, go to the Modifier tab, and hit Apply on the Displace modifier. Tab into Edit mode, and with Proportional Editing enabled, reposition the vertices for general appearance. Focus on any parts of the mesh that visibly intersect other parts of the mesh. Alright, now we get to work with the top bun. Let's unhide it, and on second thought, let's start anew. Delete the top bun and add a circle with the default number of vertices, 32. Hit F to fill the circle in with the face, E to extrude up, add some edge loops, I use 6. Select the top face, ensure proportional editing is on, and scale that face down. Make any necessary adjustments to get the shape you like. Add a subsurface modifier and enable smooth shading. If the top of your bun looks too flat, scale that top face down as small as it can go. Select the bottom face and hit I to inset it. Purely subjective, but check to make sure the top bun and the bottom bun are close in size. Then make some more adjustments to the lettuce once the top bun is in place. Apply the transformations and set the top bun's origin to geometry. We could stop there, but we'll add some sesame seeds to this bun using a particle system. First, we need to create the seed. Add a cube, scale it until it looks like a tall, thin, rectangular cuboid. Scale the bottom face down and add an edge loop close to the bottom. Add a subsurface modifier and enable smooth shading. Add a second edge loop and adjust the shape as shown. Scale the object down a bit and apply the scale transformation. With the top bun selected, add a new particle system. Select hair and lower the number to something low like 25. We'll change this once the actual particles are in place. Open the Render tab and select Object. For the instance object, use the eyedropper to select our seed. Check Object Rotation and check Advanced to enable velocity rotation in physics. We only need rotation here, so check that. Increase the randomness and increase the phase and phase randomness. Under Render, increase the object scale and scale randomness. I fiddled around with these settings a lot and will tweak them again later on, but for now I settled on emitting from faces with 3 particles per face and a number of particles at around 468. Now we have seeds generating all over the bun, even on the underside. The 3 particles per face limits the number of seeds on the underside to a minimum, but if you want to clear them off entirely, use weight painting. Switch over to weight paint mode and disable the particle system for easier use. There will be no particles where the weight is 0 or blue, and maximum possible particles given your system settings where the weight is 1 or red. Select the paintbrush and increase the weight to 1. Paint over the top of the bun until it's completely red. Always a good idea to label everything in Blender, including your vertex groups. Now go back to the particle system and find vertex groups towards the bottom. Click in the density block and select the vertex group we just created. There are a few stragglers here, which means I didn't do a great job painting, so back into weight paint mode to clean up any loose edges. These changes will automatically propagate into the particle system. A few more tweaks to the particle system settings and back into edit mode to make a few tiny adjustments to the lettuce mesh. To add a toothpick, add a cube, Shift Z to scale along the X and Y axis only, and then add a subsurface modifier. To add a plate, add a circle, fill it with a face, eye to inset, and scale the inner circle in and move it down a bit. Add a few edge loops for design and add one close to the outer edge. Select those faces around the outer edge and extrude up to give the plate a lip. Add a subsurface modifier and enable smooth shading. Tighten the edge around the inner circle with an extra edge loop. Add a material for the plate and click Assign. This will be the plate's main color. Select the accent rings we created and add a new material for an accent color and click Assign. Add a plane for the surface and check front view to make sure it's flush with the plate's bottom face. And that's it for modeling. I modeled this burger with no regard to scale, and now we have a burger that's 2 meters in diameter. We can select everything and scale it down to something more accurate. Select the burger first and then everything else. This will keep the burger as the active object. With everything selected, we can scale it down to a more accurate size. The reason this is important is because the size of your objects affects the strength of the light needed to illuminate them and the scales of the procedural textures used. In order for the scaling numbers of the textures to work properly, your object sizes must be comparable to those shown here. Alternatively, you'll be able to see the texture patterns on the mesh every step of the way, and as long as the textures you use look similar to what's shown here, model size won't matter. For those choosing to follow along, I'm scaling the burger down to 0.15 meters. Now I'll have to adjust any modifiers as well. Scale the sesame seeds down to 0.005. Apply the scale transformation to all objects. Select the cheese and lower its thickness on the solidifier modifier to 0.003, and select the lettuce and lower its thickness to 0.002. With the modeling complete, I make a few more object adjustments, including the camera and lights. I felt it was missing something, so I'm going to add some dollops of mayo to this burger. To do this, I'll add a round cube mesh. If you don't see this option, go to Preferences, Add-ons, and enable the Add Mesh Extra Objects add-on. Add the round cube, scale it down, and with proportional editing enabled, shape it to look like a blob. Duplicate it and reshape it as many times as you like. And before I get started with procedural textures, I create material placeholders for all the objects. This just makes it easier to work with for some reason. For procedural textures, I use a vertical layout, so I'll quickly create a new workspace. Let's start with the bottom bun. We'll begin with displacement. Now, displacement changes the actual shape of the mesh. In order for node displacement to work in Blender, there are 3 things we must change. First, the render engine must be on cycles, with the experimental feature set enabled. Second, we must have a subsurface modifier added to the mesh. Once the experimental feature is enabled, the adaptive option will appear. Be sure to check that. The third change takes place in the materials settings. Find displacement under Settings, Surface, and select Displacement and Bump. Now we can create a displacement texture. I'll be using this texture to create the tiny air holes often found in breads. Shift A to add a Voronoi texture. With the Voronoi texture still selected, Control T to automatically connect a texture coordinate and mapping node. If the shortcut doesn't work for you, you may need to enable the Node Wrangler add-on. In Preferences, search for Node Wrangler and ensure that it is checked. Connect a color ramp and hold Control and Shift down while you click on the color ramp. This works for any node and will display the texture up to that point on your mesh. Move the black and white markers inward. The closer these are together, the less gray we'll see in the texture. Adjust the mapping node's scale values to get roundish circles that are somewhat small. Tighten the color ramp even more. These holes are usually large at the base and then get smaller as they move towards the top of the bun. So duplicate the entire group and move it up. Control Shift on this new color ramp and increase the scale on the Voronoi node to make a field of smaller dots. We'll mix both textures using a gradient texture, so add a gradient texture. Control T for a texture coordinate and mapping node and connect a color ramp. Shift Control the color ramp to view it on your model. Rotate the gradient 90 degrees along the y-axis. Bring the black and white markers closer together. Now add a Mix RGB node. The Mix RGB node takes grayscale data as a FAC input and mixes two colors accordingly. Color 1 will replace all black data, and color 2 replaces all white data, and a mixture of the two is used for any gray values. I'll demonstrate with green and red. We'll want the large circles on the green area, which means it needs to be connected to the top connector, color 1, and the smaller circles will go in the bottom connector for color 2. Now we can adjust the markers in the gradients color ramp to modify how the two textures are mixed together on the mesh. The air bubbles on a hamburger bun usually diminish towards the top of the bun, so we'll use another gradient texture to fade out these dots. Add a gradient texture with coordinate and mapping nodes. Connect a color ramp. Rotate the gradient 90 degrees along the y-axis. Shift the black marker towards the right. This will show our dots texture at its strongest. Add another marker and make it gray. Connect the color ramp to the FAC of a new Mix RGB node. Set color 2 to white and connect our dots texture to color 1. And that's it. Bring this white marker towards the left to extend the area where no dots will show. We can always tweak things later on, but this looks good for now. Add a displacement node and connect the Mix RGB's color to the displacement node's height. And connect this node to the material output. This displacement is very small, so change the scale on the displacement node to 0.003. Hold Shift and Control and select the principled shader to see the entire material so far. Make adjustments to these color ramps to get something that looks pleasing to you. Now we'll add a bump texture. Normals are used to create the illusion of displacement using light. Begin by adding a noise texture with mapping and texture coordinate nodes. Connect the color ramp. Change the mapping scale to 40 for all axes. Modify the color ramp as shown until we get the noise pattern shown here. Add another noise texture with coordinate and mapping nodes and add a color ramp to the other side. Change the mapping scale for all axes to 3 and adjust the color ramp as shown. Increase the noise texture scale to 3.6. Add an add node, a math node, set to add, to combine both noise textures, and a bump node on the other side. Connect the add node's value to the bump node's height and connect the bump node to the shader's normal input. Lower the bump node's strength to 0.5 and the distance to 0.7. Select all of these nodes and hit Shift P to put them in a frame. Frames allow you to move a collection of nodes as one. These are great for organizing textures, especially as your materials become complex. Let's add another gradient texture for the color. Control T for the texture and mapping nodes and connect the color ramp. Rotate the gradient 90 degrees on the y-axis. Bring the black and white markers in just a bit. Change the black marker to a dark brown. Change the white marker to a light brown and add two new markers in the middle for two more shades of brown, both increasingly lighter than the one to its left. Add a noise texture with coordinate, mapping, and color ramp nodes. Move the black marker closer to the center. Change the mapping Y scale value to 0.7 and the X scale value to 0.8. Move this whole group to the top. This noise texture will serve as a FAC for a Mix RGB node, so let's add one. Change color 2 to match the lightest color in your color gradient, easily done with the eyedropper. Connect our color gradient to color 1 and the noise gradient to the FAC. Make a few adjustments to the noise gradient's color ramp, minimizing the light overlays. This is just to break up our gradient. Change the white marker to gray to mix the light color noise with the brown gradient underneath. Connect the Mix RGB node to the Principled Shader's color. Shift Control the Principled Shader to see the whole thing on your model. A few minor adjustments, and let's check it out in render mode. This looks pretty good for now. I know you probably can't see the air holes we made, but they are there. Once the rest of the burger is done, we'll refine how these individual parts look. But now, we'll get started on the hamburger. But while I'm thinking about it, one quick change to the bottom bun's shader. Let's lower the specular to next to nothing. I'm using 0.005. Now back to the burger. We'll start with displacement again. Add a noise texture with the usual trimmings. Change the texture coordinate node to Object. Change the mapping scale to 50 across all axes. Move the black and white markers closer to center. Lower the texture scale to 4.8 and increase the detail to 3.8. Add a displacement node and connect the color to the node's height input. Change the scale to 0.005. Shift Control on the shader to see the displacement on the model. Change the color ramp to Ease. To see the actual displacement on your model, we must be in render view mode. Every material using a displacement node must have the material's surface displacement setting changed to displacement and bump. As you can see, the actual shape of the mesh has changed. Lower the displacement scale to 0.004 and lower the noise texture scale to 3.4. Oops, I forgot to remove the collision modifier from the cloth simulation we used to make the cheese. In order for displacements to work well, we need that adaptive option on the subsurface modifier, and that's only available if the subsurface modifier is the last or only modifier in the stack. So we don't need this collision modifier anymore. We'll remove it from the Physics tab. Back to the subsurface modifier, let's increase the viewport level to 2. That'll show a bit more detail on our burger texture. Now reduce the displacement scale to 0.002. That looks pretty good. Let's put all of this into a frame using Shift P and move on to creating a bump map. Add a noise texture with the usual bits and a bump node. Connect the color ramp to the bump node's height. We'll disconnect the displacement for now just to see the bump map clearly. Change the texture coordinate to Object and set the mapping scale to 40. Modify the color ramp like so, and let's change the mapping scale to 100 now. Set the bump strength to 0.4 and view it on the model. Put this all in a frame, and now we can work on the color. Disconnect the bump node so we can see the color clearly. Add another noise texture with the usual bits and set the texture coordinate to Object. Set the mapping scale to 50, modify the color ramp as shown, and increase the noise texture detail to 7.4. Add a Mix RGB node and plug the color ramp's color into the Mix node's FAC. Add an RGB node and a hue saturation value node. Connect the RGB's output to color 1 of your Mix node and the color input on the hue saturation and value node. Pick a nice brown color out of the RGB node and then set the saturation to 2. Shift Control on the Mix node to see the effect. Lower the hue saturation and values FAC and/or adjust the color ramp until the pattern looks like this on the mesh. Now put all of this into a frame. You can name, label, and color frames to keep track of them. I usually add a color that's close to the dominant color of the frame nodes. Duplicate the entire frame and move it up. Shift Control on the new color ramp to view it in the model. Increase the noise texture scale to 9.3 and tighten the black and white markers on the color ramp. Control Shift on the mixer and change the RGB's color to a pale brown. Lower the hue saturation and values FAC to 0.915. Add another Mix RGB node to mix these two together. For the FAC, we will use a Musgrave texture. Add the coordinate mapping and color ramp nodes. Change the coordinate to Object. Increase the mapping scale to 70. Increase the Musgrave's detail to 6 and change the dimension to 0.6. Change the liquidity to 2.1. Connect the dark brown to color 1 and the lighter pale brown to color 2. For one more layer of noisy color, add a noise texture with coordinate mapping and color ramp nodes. Set the texture coordinate to object, set the mapping scale to 50, adjust the color ramp, and add an RGB node. Instead of the hue, saturation, and value node, use a brightness and contrast node here. For what it's worth, we probably could have used brightness and contrast nodes for all of the HSV nodes. I just didn't think about it until now. At any rate, connect both nodes to the Mix RGB node just like before. Pick a dark red or rust color and set the brightness to -2.1 and use the noise texture as the Mix RGB node's FAC. On second thought, let's lower this brightness to -0.6. Put these nodes in their own frame as well. Add another Mix RGB node and connect the texture we just created to color 1 and this other texture group into color 2. Connect this Mix RGB node's output to the principal shader's color input and connect the bump texture to the shader's normal. Alright, we're going to create one more texture for the material's roughness. Add a noise texture with the usual suspects. Objects for the texture coordinate mapping scale is set to 50. Increase the contrast by tightening in the markers on the color ramp and connect the color ramp's color to the shader's roughness. Tighten the contrast on the color ramp just a bit, and remember the white areas will be 100% rough and the black areas will have 0 roughness. Reconnect the displacement node, and that's it for our hamburger. Very simple cheese settings here: a mild yellow for the color, roughness down to 0.255, specular set to 0.241, and sheen at 0.336 with a sheen tint around 0.082. If the displacement on your burger pokes through the cheese, you may want to modify the cheese mesh to remedy that. Alright, not bad. Let's take a look at the tomatoes now. Hide the top bun. Let's group these mayo blobs as one object and hide them along with the lettuce. Apply rotation and scale transformations. We'll start with the fleshy part of the tomato. Add a gradient texture with coordinate and mapping nodes. Set the texture coordinate to object and the gradient to spherical. Set the mapping scale to 26. Z can be 0. It doesn't affect this gradient since the affected mesh is two-dimensional. We just want the edges to be black or gray, fading to the white center. Adjust the color ramp to refine the gradient's transition. Add a noise texture and a color ramp. Increase the noise texture scale to 16.3 and tighten the color ramp's markers. Add a Mix RGB node and connect the color ramp to its FAC input. Set color 1 to a light orange-red color and color 2 to a light orange color. Add another Mix RGB node and connect our orange blend to its color 2 input. Connect the gradient to its FAC. Tighten the gradient's contrast by adjusting the color ramp's markers as shown. Select color 1 and choose a red color. We'll use the same color for the tomato's skin. Put all of this in a frame. Connect the color to the shader's color input. I added a little nuance to these slices with subsurface coloring. So add a noise texture and a color ramp. Change the noise texture scale to 21.3. Move the color ramp's markers closer to the center to create a sharp contrast. Change the black marker's color to red and the white marker's color to orange. Set the subsurface to about 0.15. For the material's normal, add a noise texture with coordinate and mapping nodes. Set the coordinate to object, the mapping scale to 80, and add a color ramp. Increase the color ramp's contrast. Change the mapping scale to 80 and the noise texture scale to about 22.9. Increase the detail to about 8.9. We just want the noise to be very small. Add a bump node. Connect the color ramp's color to the bump's height. Set bump strength to 0.5. Increase the shader's specular to 0.755 and lower roughness to 0.15. It looks a bit odd now because we're in viewport mode, but don't worry, it'll look better once we've rendered it out. Let's get to work on the juicy part. Add a noise texture and a color ramp. Bring the markers in like shown. Set the noise scale to 13.7, the detail to 1.4, and the distortion to 1.9. Add a bump node and connect everything. Set the strength to 0.375. For the color, add another noise texture and set the scale to 32.5 and the detail to 3.4. Change one color marker to a rusty brown and the other to a red color. Connect it to the shader's input. Set the specular to 0.841, the metallic to 0.145, and bring the roughness down to 0. Set the sheen to 0.632 and leave the sheen tint at 0.5. Hold Ctrl-Shift and click on the shader to view it on the model. Actually, let's lower the sheen to 0.145 and set the sheen tint to 0.345. Now let's take a look and render. That looks alright, but specular and normals need light. So I'll reposition this light, add a new one, and check render view again. I just make a tiny adjustment to the gradient scale here by lowering Y to 27.5 and tightening up the contrast of this gradient with the color ramp. Since I want the tomato skin, or tomato edge material as I've called it, to blend seamlessly with the border of this gradient, I'm going to create a group from the subsurface nodes by selecting them and hitting Ctrl-G. This group has no input, so I'll remove the group input node and I'll rename this Tom_sub. For the tomato edge texture, use the same color we used for the edges before. For me, it was CC2015. Add a noise texture and color ramp. Set the scale to 3.8 and the detail to 0.8. Move the markers in slightly until you get something similar to this. Add a bump node and connect everything. Set the strength to 0.05. In order for this seamlessness to work, the subsurface settings need to be identical on both textures, so I'll set both values to 0.95. Back to the tomato edge material to add the Tom_sub node group. Let's connect it to the shader subsurface color. Okay, and now this is what it looks like rendered. Alright, let us move on. Add a Voronoi texture with coordinate and mapping nodes. Set the mapping node to 25. Set the coordinate to object. Connect the Voronoi distance to the color ramp's FAC. Adjust the markers like so. Duplicate all 4 nodes. Click on the second Voronoi texture and hit Shift-S on your keyboard. This will bring up the Add menu and allow you to switch the node you selected to virtually any node you choose. Choose a noise texture. Adjust the color ramp as shown. Add a Mix RGB node and connect both texture groups to it. Set the FAC to 0.517. Add a bump node and set the strength to 0.2. Put a frame around the normal map nodes and move on to the colored nodes. Add Voronoi texture. Add coordinate and mapping nodes and a color ramp. Change the coordinate to object. Set the mapping node scale to 25 across all vectors. Set the Voronoi scale to 7.7. Adjust the color ramp as shown, moving both markers to the left, and assign a shade of green to each. Duplicate the nodes and move them down below. On the top Voronoi texture, change the connector from color to distance, and set this to distance to edge. Set the bottom Voronoi to smooth F1. Change the scale to 3.9 and the smoothness set it to 0.833. Set up the color ramp as shown. We'll put a texture to mix them at the top. Add a noise texture and color ramp. Set the noise scale to 10.3 and move the color ramp's markers closer together like shown. Add a Mix RGB node and connect both textures to it. Connect the noise texture at the top to the Mix RGB node's FAC. Connect the Mix RGB node to the shader's color input. Put a frame around the entire color texture. The last step for the lettuce is a texture for the roughness. Add a noise texture with coordinate and mapping nodes. Set the coordinate to object. Set the mapping node scale to 25. Add a color ramp and tighten the markers like shown. Connect the color ramp to the shader's roughness. And that's it. Now for the top bun. Add a gradient texture with coordinate and mapping nodes. Connect a color ramp. Use the mapping node to rotate the texture on the y-axis 90 degrees. Set the color ramp up as shown here. We're looking for a gradient from light pale brown to a tan or Peru brown. Use another marker to ensure the light brown is just around the bun's edges. Add a noise texture with coordinate and mapping nodes. Set the coordinate to object, the mapping scale to 300, and add a color ramp. Change the noise texture scale to 6.9 and its detail to 6.7. Bring the color ramp markers in close to center until you get the texture shown here. And connect a bump node. Now here I made a mistake by switching this to displacement and bump. I later switch it back to bump only. Bump only means all the textures connected to any form of displacement on a material will render as only bump. So when I later add the material's displacement nodes, they will render as bump and not displacement. Connect a bump node and set the strength to 0.442. Control shift the shader to see the bump texture on the model. Connect the color to view it on the model as well. Adjust the colors to your liking. Add a math node set to add. Connect the bump texture's color ramp output to the value input of the add node. Set the value to be added to 0.6. Add a mix node. We're going to take the bump texture and use it to add some color specs to the bun's surface. Connect the add node's output to the mix RGB node's FAC. The add node just lightens the texture, moving each value closer to white. Connect the color ramp's output to the mix RGB node's color 2 input. Set the color 1 value to black. A few more color adjustments and a couple frames. For this material's roughness, add a noise texture connected to a color ramp. Tighten the color ramp's markers. Connect the color ramp to the shader's roughness. Lower the specular to 0.109. Now increase the bump's noise texture scale to 9.4. Back to the shader to set the sheen to 0.541 and the tint to 0.855. Now we're going to add minor cracks or deformations using the displacement connector. Add a noise texture with coordinate and mapping nodes. Set the coordinate to object. Add a color ramp and set the mapping scale to 10. Increase the texture's detail to 9.3 and the distortion to 2.2. Lower the scale to 2.5. We're going for a slightly wavy pattern as shown. Increase the contrast by tightening up the color ramp's markers. Now duplicate these 4 nodes and drag them down below. Set the mapping to 50 and the noise texture scale to 17.3. Shift the color ramp as shown. We're just adding this noise to break up the smoothness of the larger noise texture. So let's bring in a mix RGB node and connect them both. Set the mix node's FAC to 0.542. Add a displacement node and connect it. Set the displacement's mid-level to 1 and the scale to 1.2. Shift control the shader to see the entire material in the model. Let's add an invert node after the second group's color ramp and set its FAC to 0.567. Adjust these color ramps until you see a decent amount of deformations in the bun. Connect the top color ramp to the mix RGB node's FAC and move the invert node's output to the color 1 input. Set the invert FAC to 0.675. Now we'll just take care of the sesame seeds. Set the color to a pale yellow. Set the metallic to 0.177, the specular to 0.218, and the roughness to 0.309. I fiddled around with the particles until I got what you see here, using these settings shown. I'll quickly set the mayo's material. The color should already be white, so all we need to do is lower the roughness to 0.182. Here's where I switch the top bun's material settings to bump only. To accommodate this change, I changed the swirly noise pattern's color ramp by bringing the markers closer together, and I increased the noise texture scale to 4. Let's go back to the bottom bun to refine the material. Switch the texture coordinate node for the large dots to object. Set the mapping to 10. These steps ensure the dots will be round. Increase the texture scale to 30.9. For the smaller dots, increase the scale to 11.2. Shift the gray marker of the color ramp that controls the gradient for all of the dots to the right. This will prevent some of the holes from appearing near the top of the bun. some minor mesh adjustments, and then remove the roughness from the plate's materials. Add a color to the surface below, duplicate the mesh, rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis, and position it behind the burger. I left the original light settings alone, but this light closer to the burger I gave a yellowish tint and set the power to 3 watts. And that's how I made a procedural burger in Blender 2.82. Alright, thanks for checking this out and hanging in there with me. If you found this tutorial helpful, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more, be sure to subscribe. Blender is a fantastic tool and I am constantly learning and improving, as will my tutorials. Please feel free to put any questions in the comment section down below, along with any suggestions for future tutorials that you might have. Alright, have a great day and keep blending.